It seems kind of wild that in the year of our Lord 2024, we still have the trans panic defense and the gay panic defense. If you're unfamiliar, generally speaking, with this concept, the concept, I mean, let's focus up on the trans issue, is like if, let's say, like a cisgender man sleeps with a trans woman and then he has like an existential crisis during his post-nut clarity, and then he does a violence on her that like results in her death, then they do this thing sometimes where they invoke the trans panic defense, which is like, I didn't know she was trans and then I found out and I freaked out about it. And this is considered like a defense that is like acceptable to invoke, apparently, in defense in court. And literally people will have a reduced sentence as a result. You know, they would be charged for like first degree murder, but they invoke the trans panic defense and then they get like a reduced charge, which usually it also involves like a reduced sentencing, reduced punishment, not as much jail time or whatever. And so it's pretty awful that it exists. Pretty big deal, pretty not good. And there are some places that are starting to change the law. Unfortunately, that usually happens after something egregious occurs, like someone gets murdered and then there's like a push to change the law. So today we're discussing the fact that Minnesota thankfully banned gay and trans panic defense this past month. And unfortunately, the unfortunate thing about it is that this didn't happen until after a murder of a trans woman and then a subsequent, rallying cry from her family to change the law. So I want to discuss Savannah Ryan Williams briefly here and just kind of talk about her and, acknowledge that this is why, like, okay, good news. Yeah. Minnesota bans gay and trans panic defense. Good news. Yeah. Not 100% good news. It's reactive. It's one of the things that bothers me so much about the law in the United States is that it's reactive to harm. So, a company spills a bunch of toxic chemicals and causes multiple generations of cancer and fertility issues in a community. And then, like, after all that happens, then those chemicals aren't allowed to be used. Or afterwards, then they get fined. And I mean, like, realistically, there's no true justice in those situations, but whatever. So many women out there are like, I'm being stalked by this person. Like Rebecca Watson, I remember, talked about it years ago, that there was someone who had been sending her death threats and was saying that they were going to show up at an event of hers to do something violent to her. And she contacted the police, and the police were basically like, well, let us know after you're dead and then we'll do something. Like, essentially, that's the response. So, criticism of the way that we do things in the United States there. But Savannah Williams, 38-year-old Cuban and Native American trans woman, she was killed in Minneapolis in November last year. Her loved ones and members of the city's LGBTQ plus community are mourning her death and calling on lawmakers to address the epidemic of anti-trans violence. She was found on November 29 in South Minneapolis with a gunshot wound to the head. 25-year-old Demarian Bible was charged with second-degree murder in her death. According to law enforcement documents seen by the Minnesota Reformer, Bible claims that he and Williams had sex in a courtyard and that afterward he shot her because she, quote, made him feel suspicious. So he was basically trying to invoke the trans panic defense there. So her family is basically saying she was a really kind woman. She was the kind of person who would give someone the shoes off her feet and go barefoot. This family member, Gabrielle, adds, I just would like the world to know that Savannah meant the world to me and my kids. She would give me her last, and she was very loved by her family. Her partner of 7 years, Courtney Mason, remembered her love of movies and music by Beyonce and Drake, saying, quote, she was a very caring, loving person. That's always the case in these situations. I guess, it's one of those, like, we're not going to speak ill of the dead things, but trans women as a group, especially the ones who get in the news like this, they are usually like really sweet people. Their whole families are like, they were so sweet. They were a contributing member of society and they didn't she didn't deserve this consistently. Let's see. So basically in the aftermath of this tragedy, the co-leader of Tea Time, Amber Mumm, who is this is a local support network for trans women. they've called on Minnesota to decriminalize sex work, first of all, and also ban the, quote, trans panic defense, describing Williams as fierce and full of life. And, of course, commentary like particularly trans women of color are experiencing these types of violence, long-standing and systemic inequities. Representative Lee Finka, who was the first ever openly trans legislator to serve in the Minnesota House, was present at this event. Finka emphasized that although the state of Minnesota has, previously became a refuge for gender-affirming care earlier this year, like they passed laws in Minnesota saying this is a refuge state if you are trans and the state that you live in has denied you health care, then, we are going to make sure that you have access to it. But pointing out that, laws are not enough. You need to have a culture of safety in this situation. Williams' murder was the second widely reported attack on a trans woman in Minneapolis in 2023. In February, 3 attackers violently assaulted and robbed an unnamed trans woman at one of the city's light rail stations. This quote says, "Policy cannot save us. Anti-trans violence is an epidemic. It is everywhere." Continuing, "Our communities will not be safe until every one of our neighbors sees our humanity, celebrates our individuality, and embraces this beautiful community." Basically, the point being, yes, we can change the law, but just changing the law isn't necessarily going to fix the situation, right? So again, it's good news what we're discussing here. Governor Tim Walz signed a ban on the gay and trans panic defense into law just last week. And that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that it's going to stop murders from happening. It just means that sentencing for those murderers is going to be more stringent. Like they won't have the opportunity to weasel out of what are the normal murder charges that you would get. Like this is not like addressing the situation before it becomes a problem. You could also be focusing on making sure that we have trans education in schools and like the decriminalization of sex work as well, which was part of what was called for in this other article. That means that if she was doing sex work, which I guess is sort of the implication, then she could be doing it more safely rather than having to put herself in unsafe situations. Like this is part of, the problem with FOSTA SESTA, which passed a few years back with bipartisan support. If y'all remember that, that's kind of what shut down Craigslist personal ads. And it also shut down a couple of other websites, that was how sex workers, predominantly women, were like screening the Johns. They were like, here's a place where we can meet clients and we can check their references basically and make sure that we are not putting ourselves in an unsafe situation. Many women have gone missing since FOSTA SESTA was passed because you're taking women who are able to screen their clients and now they don't have the ability to screen their clients. So now they're out doing work on the street again, which is similar to this situation if I'm understanding it correctly. And that's unsafe. And it's especially unsafe for trans women. Sex workers are some of the only people in this country who don't have legal protections at their job. Contractors, don't have full protections in a way, and like government workers get more protections than other types of contractors and everything. But like sex workers have to just, if they're assaulted, if they're sexually assaulted, they just don't have recourse because you can then get arrested for doing sex work. Shakespeare clarifies, according to people who are close to Savannah, she was not a sex worker. None of us know what happened. All we have is the murderer's word for what happened. And that's what the trans panic defense allows, for our stories to be erased and our voices to be gone. Thank you for clarifying that. This guy claimed that he had just had sex with her, but it was also in this article that she was like married. Savannah was like, I think, married to her partner. And like, that doesn't preclude her from doing sex work, right? But it's like invoking the concept of sex work on top of invoking the fact that she was trans is a way of devaluing her life, making it so that like, oh, well, she deserved it, and sex workers are disposable. Women are disposable generally. Trans women are disposable generally. Sex workers are disposable for sure, especially female sex workers. But according to people close to Savannah, that wasn't even part of this. It was just this dude claimed that was part of it. And we don't know what happened because obviously if this happened in like a public park, There's not necessarily going to be cameras everywhere. Hey, you should like, comment, and subscribe. And you can hit up the Patreon or maybe buy one of these hoodies that I'm wearing because it's good merch. Do it. Do it for the cat. Do it. Do it. It seems like she had an established community. It's not like she was out there homeless on the street. She had people who were waiting for her to come home, right? So it's horrible that this happened. And I'm also glad that they used this, the family and the community used this as an opportunity to call for increased legal protections so that at least if you are the kind of person who wants to do a violent crime to a trans person, you won't be thinking to yourself, oh, I can just claim that she was a sex worker who tricked me, and then I won't get put in prison or whatever. Minneapolis, Minnesota is kind of a battleground. It may seem fairly progressive in the modern era, but hasn't always been. And some of these, backwards people are still here, and they become more violent, such as the MPD. Right. Let's not forget, it was George Floyd, right? That whole thing started in Minneapolis. Or maybe I'm thinking of another high-profile thing, but like the Minnesota Police Department are violent toward people. Like there is a pretty solid amount of segregation also in Minneapolis, where there's like a pretty big Somali community there that gets like really heavily over-policed. Shakespeare also adds that the local news channels left comments open on these articles, and the responses to it were heinous. The news stations also doxed the trans woman support group that we're all a part of, so we ended up having to call off our candlelight vigils for Savannah due to these threats, which were mostly coming from out of state. And that's unfortunate because you have to call it off. If there's going to be a threat there, you can't rely on the Minneapolis Police Department. And just because these people are out of state doesn't mean that they won't come in. Like, they will come in from out of state. I was reading an article recently that was basically saying that the people who are showing up at all these different kinds of protests and counter-protests, the ones who are anti-vax, the ones who are anti-queer, the ones who are like Zionist, it's like the same group of people going around the country to all these different events, being threatening, being violent toward people. So unfortunately, the thing to do in the community is you have to take those threats seriously if you know that you don't have security, right? I mean, I wish that there were more John Brown gun clubs across the country to support and provide security in these situations. I have seen instances where communities have come together in that way, where, like anti-fascist people wearing all black with a trans flag attached to their gun are like defending a drag bar. Like we've seen that over the last 2 years, but it's not always accessible. And sometimes I can understand, especially a group of trans women who are highly vulnerable might not want to risk it anyway. Even if you do have private security, even if you do have volunteer private security, knowing that the cops are hostile to us, like, Minneapolis Police Department produced Derek Chauvin, and like the whole entire year worth of protests, that like locus point was Minneapolis. Minneapolis is in the Midwest, y'all. It's like how there are areas in like all of these states that are pretty liberal. Minneapolis is a pretty liberal city in a state that is broadly like pretty rural and probably has a lot of backwards people there. Same deal in Kansas where I live. There are like 2 or 3 areas, maybe a grand total of 5 counties in Kansas that tend to lean Democrat. But then, you step outside those cities and suddenly, you're dealing with rednecks again, and it's not safe. So it would be great if this wasn't a thing that we're gonna continue to be dealing with for a while. Like, you want to think, oh, well, things are going to be better now. They got rid of the trans panic defense, and that's a good thing. But like, we're still dealing with such a heightened degree of polarization on this issue, where so many folks are like having this, it's like ratcheting up even further their completely unfounded, borderline delusional hatred of trans people. And whether it's trans people, whether it's immigrants, whether it's Chinese folks, whether it's Muslims, like there's always some group that's catching the end of this. And just for frame of reference, these are the United States states and territories that do or do not have a trans panic defense, gay or trans panic defense. So the ones that are dark green are the ones that prohibit any kind of trans panic defense. And the ones in the yellowish lighter color are ones that don't have an explicit ban on this, like does not prohibit the use of legal defenses claiming that the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity contributed to the defendant's actions. So in the majority of states, 32 states, 5 territories, you can just be like, well, I found out that they were gay and I freaked out and I killed them, and that's why I shouldn't get as big of a sentence. And then they'll just run with that, apparently. Yeah, good Lord, Massachusetts. Like, Massachusetts, like, the only state in New England, I guess Pennsylvania is kind of part of New England, but like, come on, get with the times here. This is like this map is also sort of representative of the just like in the party line polarization. Like, either you're overtly liberal in these particular areas on the coasts, and then like, of course, the couple of states in the middle, or you're like basically falling in line with all these other Republican conservative ideals and values. Except for Massachusetts. Get your shit together, Massachusetts. Oh, God. Yeah, and apparently this whole situation lets you lie about having sex with them, too. You know, like, again, this guy claiming that he slept with her in the courtyard of a park, but she has a partner, and all of her friends and family say that she was not a sex worker, so, like, just making it up. And I think part of the gay panic defense is that you can claim that that gay person tried to hit on you, and it freaked you out so hard that you responded violently. Like, why does this exist in the first place? I don't even want to look. I was going to be like, maybe I should Google, like, what was the first time the gay panic defense was used or the trans panic defense was used in the United States? But I don't want to know. Just get rid of it. Just ban it explicitly. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's much more that we can say about it. Like, it still sucks to be trans in this country. It's going to keep sucking for a while. But at least there are areas that are acknowledging that this isn't okay. You know, Minnesota's law will go into effect August 1st this year, and they've passed other laws protecting trans people. We just need to get culturally on board with this, like with more trans protections and with more cultural acceptance, like not making it a big deal to be trans and like, you know, doing everything we can to combat this groomer rhetoric. But it's just gonna still be weird for a while. I'm not the praying kind of person, but like, I want to send sentiments of prayer to Savannah Williams' family. You know, it's not an easy thing to deal with, and for their pain to be exposed on the broad, like, national scale has to be difficult to deal with. And of course, we need to make sure we're keeping in mind that it's primarily trans women of color who are experiencing this, like, violence, and that we should, as a community, I think, do a better job of not writing off trans women and not writing off trans women of color. If they say something moderately problematic on Twitter, like, maybe understand that they're dealing with more stress than probably any of the rest of us. They're dealing with housing insecurity. They're dealing with a difficulty finding work. They're dealing with, you know, partners who are abusive or who are refusing to acknowledge them as their partner in public. And, you know, there's just so many compounding factors that I think that within the trans community, we should probably try to give each other a little bit more grace and a little bit more understanding, and try to make sure that these people have solid support networks so that this stuff doesn't happen. These things happen to people who are vulnerable because the kind of people who prey on others, they don't prey on the strong. They don't prey on people who have, like, solid community support. That's why homeless people are subject to so many crimes, because there's this idea like, oh, well, no one will care if you disappear anyway. So yeah, we need to be careful that we're not treating trans women, and particularly trans women of color, like they're disposable. We need everybody to know that we're going to go to bat for each other, that we're going to circle the wagons, we're going to protect our own, and we're not going to, like, get into petty fights with each other. Because maybe, yeah, maybe this kind of stuff would happen less. It's all post hoc rationalization, though. So all we can say now is I hope that her family is able to move on, like, to keep her memory alive and keep their lives going. You know, hopefully this doesn't have a ripple effect where people don't recover from their grief and everything. And I hope that this means that the community in Minneapolis, you know, can use this as an opportunity to kind of come together and put more resources into protecting the most vulnerable among them. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, especially Tiago Nascimento, Mersh Rolvog, Michelle Frateroli, Amanda B., Michelle Winter, Wellington Marcus, Danielle McDonald, DZXN, Suzanne Maynard, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Ella V. Nobody, Pastel Infinity, Jamie Jam, Nova, Sojo, Elizabeth Bartell, Kevin Young, Athiette, Celeste, Desi Quiche, Liam Hodgson, Mr. Atheist, and Jack.